I used to believe danger announced itself with noise, that it always came with shouting, slamming doors, or something breaking. I never imagined it could slip into a room without a sound settle behind me like a shadow and wait for the perfect moment to strike. That night in the bathroom, everything felt strangely quiet. The light above the mirror flickered faintly, the faucet dripped at an uneven rhythm, and there was still steam clinging to the edges of the glass. I was sitting on the edge of the bathtub, rinsing conditioner from my fingers, thinking about nothing important, when the door opened without warning. Nathan walked in like he owned the space. He never knocked. He said knocking was for strangers, and since we were family, he had the right to walk in whenever he pleased. I felt that old familiar tension crawl up my spine, the one I had carried since childhood, whenever he stood too close. He hovered behind me, watching the water swirl down the drain as if studying something weak, something that needed correcting. He muttered that I was always slow to react, slow to defend myself, slow to stand my ground. I tried to laugh it off the way I always did, but the sound wavered thin and uncertain. Nathan leaned closer and said he wanted to prove a point, that there were lessons people only learned when exposed to pressure. Pressure. His favorite word. Pressure builds strength. Pressure reveals character. Pressure separates the resilient from the fragile. I hated the way he said it. I hated the look in his eyes even more because it was the same look he had when we were kids, right before something bad happened. Before I could respond, his hands clamped onto my shoulders. There was no hesitation. No warning. He shoved me forward, and my face crashed into the bathwater with a force that stole every bit of air from my lungs. The water was colder than I expected, sharp enough to make my body lock up. My mouth opened in shock, and soap rushed in, filling my throat with a burning bitterness. I tried to pull back, but his grip tightened. My ears filled with a low roar, and suddenly the world went muffled like someone had pressed thick pillows against both sides of my head. My heartbeat hammered so loudly it drowned everything else out. Panic hit instantly. My hands shot forward, scraping against the slick porcelain as I kicked, desperate for leverage. My knee smacked into the metal faucet, sending a jolt up my leg. I clawed at anything I could reach, but the tub was too smooth, too clean, offering no anchor. I could not breathe. I could not lift my head. The burning in my lungs sharpened into a stabbing ache as water forced its way into my nose. The distorted glare of the overhead light blurred through the churning surface above me, turning into a trembling halo. My vision flickered as darkness gathered around the edges. Then through the haze movement, I forced my eyes upward and saw two distorted silhouettes in the doorway. My parents, standing still, watching. Their outlines warped by the water but unmistakable. My mother's arms were folded. My father stood stiff expression, unreadable from where I was submerged. They did not shout. They did not rush forward. They did not call Nathan's name. They simply watched, calm, detached, almost bored. My chest convulsed again, begging for oxygen. I kicked harder, clawing at the tub, at Nathan's wrists, at the water itself, anything to survive. The roaring in my ears grew louder. The edges of my vision pulsed dark, ready to close. Just as the world began tilting away from me, Nathan finally released his grip. My head shot above the surface, and I gasped so hard it felt like knives scraping down my throat. I coughed violently, choking as water poured from my mouth. I clung to the side of the tub, shaking uncontrollably. My eyes burned. My throat spasmed. Every breath was ragged and desperate. I looked toward the doorway, praying for concern, for love, for fear on my parents' faces. I found none. They remained exactly as before. My mother's first words were about the floor, not me. She said I had made a mess. Water was everywhere. Nathan straightened casually, wiping a drop from his sleeve, and laughed under his breath. He said I was weaker than he thought, and that maybe next time I would pay attention. I waited for someone to say anything that made sense, anything that showed they understood what had just happened. But the bathroom stayed silent except for the dripping faucet and my uneven breaths. And in that moment, still coughing, still trembling, I finally understood the truth I had avoided my entire life. I thought they would protect me. I thought they would choose me. They never did. They never would. I had never been safe in that house, not even for a second. People often assume that a family becomes dysfunctional suddenly, like something snaps one day and everything falls apart. But in my family, the cracks were always there, running beneath the surface like fault lines waiting for pressure. Looking back, I realized nothing about that night in the bathroom was new. It was only the moment when years of smaller wounds finally burst open. Growing up, Nathan was the center of everything. My parents said it was because he had a rough start in life. When he was very young, he fell from a swing at the park and hit his head. The injury was minor, barely requiring stitches, but my parents reacted as though his life had hung by a thread. They hovered over him constantly after that. Every little bruise became an emergency. Every complaint was treated as a crisis. They wrapped him in a protective bubble that hardened as he grew up, turning into something close to worship. He became the child who must never be disappointed, challenged, or contradicted. I came along 3 years later, a healthy baby. No accidents, no close calls, no reason for them to hover. And so they did not. Where Nathan was celebrated for every small accomplishment, I was brushed aside. Where Nathan's failures were met with understanding and excuses, mine were met with impatience. Where Nathan's tantrums were signs of stress or sensitivity, mine were signs of being dramatic. Everything about our family was shaped by that imbalance. Dad saw Nathan as the son who would fulfill the dreams he never reached. He had wanted to be an athlete when he was young, but life had pulled him in different directions. Nathan, tall and naturally coordinated, became his second chance. Every coach who praised him became proof that Dad had raised a future champion. Every trophy validated his belief that Nathan was destined for greatness. Meanwhile, I was the child who liked books, quiet spaces, and gentle hobbies. I learned early that my interests were viewed as weaknesses. Dad brushed them off as unimportant. Mom called them distractions. When Nathan hurt me during our childhood roughhousing, it was always somehow my fault. He pushed me too hard during backyard football, and I cracked my lip on the ground. Mom said I should have been paying attention. He shoved me off the trampoline because I did not bounce high enough, and when I cried, Dad told me I needed thicker skin. Once he locked me outside in the cold because I wouldn't give him my gloves. Mom saw me crying on the porch and said I should not upset him. It was astonishing how easily they found ways to twist every situation until Nathan became the misunderstood child and I became the overreacting one. Even teachers noticed the imbalance. During parent-teacher conferences, my accomplishments were acknowledged politely, but my parents only perked up when Nathan was mentioned. They lit up at the idea of him being athletic, competitive, dominant. They ignored how he treated me. They ignored how he treated everyone. In middle school, Nathan scared another kid so badly during a wrestling match that the boy refused to come to practice again. Dad proudly retold the story for months. He said it proved Nathan had discipline and power. I remember thinking, discipline was not supposed to look like cruelty, but in our household, cruelty often wore the disguise of strength. Mom was even more devoted to the myth of Nathan's golden future. In her eyes, he could do no wrong. If he raised his voice at me, she said he was stressed. If he broke something of mine, she said I should not have left it out. If he blamed me for something, she believed him before I could get a word out. I grew up watching them rearrange reality around him. He was the bright one, the tough one, the destined one. I was the one they barely noticed unless I became a problem. Over time, I learned not to ask for help. I learned not to expect fairness. I learned not to show when something hurt. And maybe that was the most dangerous lesson of all because it taught Nathan he would never be held accountable. It taught him that everything he did to me would be forgiven, explained away, or ignored. It taught him that my feelings did not matter, that my boundaries did not exist, and that pain inflicted on me simply did not count. When Nathan became a teenager and started training seriously for competitive sports, my parents' obsession with him grew stronger. They rearranged their schedules around his practices and competitions. They spent thousands on equipment trips and training programs. When he needed space to practice at home, they converted part of the basement into a makeshift gym. Meanwhile, my requests were always met with hesitation. When I wanted to take violin lessons, Mom said it was too expensive. When I needed help preparing for a school competition, Dad said he was too busy reviewing Nathan's training logs. When I said Nathan scared me sometimes, they told me not to provoke him. The older we got, the worse the dynamic became. Nathan learned he could push and I would fold. He learned he could intimidate and I would retreat. He learned that if he crossed a line, our parents would erase it behind him. And the more they excused him, the bolder he became. By the time I left for college, I thought I had escaped the cycle. I built a life for myself far away from them, one where people saw me as a person instead of a foil for someone else's greatness. But when Mom called and said Dad had injured his back and they needed me to come home for a while, I convinced myself things would be different now that we were adults. I should have known better. Dysfunction does not disappear just because you leave. It waits patiently. It waits for you to return. And when you do it, welcomes you back exactly where you left off. If anyone had asked me 6 months earlier whether I would ever move back into my parents' house even temporarily, I would have laughed. I had spent years building a life that felt nothing like the one I grew up in, a life where I could breathe without constantly bracing for someone's disapproval. My small apartment in the city was quiet, sunlit in the mornings, and filled with things I chose myself. My job as a speech therapy clinician was demanding but meaningful. I worked with children who had trouble finding their voices, and every time one of them made progress, it felt like I reclaimed a part of myself too. I had friends, coworkers' routines, a life that finally felt like mine. Then one afternoon, while I was charting notes after a long session, my phone buzzed. I expected a reminder or a message from a colleague. Instead, I saw my mother's name. She never called unless something was wrong. When I answered, she launched straight into an explanation without even greeting me. Dad had injured his back while lifting heavy equipment at work. According to her, the injury was severe enough that he could barely walk, let alone perform daily tasks. She said she had been trying to manage everything herself, but she was overwhelmed. She said she needed me. That last part echoed louder than the rest. She said she needed me. In my childhood, those words were rare. Yet the way she said it sounded more like a command than a request. I hesitated and she must have sensed it because she quickly added that Nathan was home too, but he was too busy preparing for an important fitness exam to help much. She said he needed a quiet environment and that my presence would help relieve some of the stress in the house. I should have recognized the familiar manipulation in her tone, the way she made it sound like I was the only reasonable choice. Instead, guilt washed over me. I pictured my father wincing in pain. I pictured my mother carrying everything alone. And I felt that old sense of obligation take hold, the same one they had used on me my entire life. I told her I needed a day to think, but by that evening she had texted 3 more times, each message layered with pressure and disappointment. By the next morning, she was crying on the phone. So I said yes. I told my supervisor I needed a temporary leave of absence, packed a suitcase, and convinced myself this would last only a few weeks. I told myself I was older now and stronger. I told myself that childhood patterns could not simply drag me back into them without my permission. I told myself that Nathan being home did not matter. I told myself many things I wish I had questioned more carefully. The drive back to my hometown felt like traveling backward in time. The closer I got, the tighter my chest felt. Old landmarks appeared unchanged, as if waiting for me to return. The high school track where Nathan used to run laps while Dad shouted instructions from the sidelines. The diner where our parents took him after every victory but never after any of mine. The park where he knocked me off the jungle gym when we were children because he said I was in his way. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked the same. Same beige siding, same cracked walkway, same porch light flickering weakly even in daylight. But something in the air felt heavier than I remembered, like the house itself exhaled a warning. Mom greeted me at the door with a forced smile. She hugged me tightly, too tightly, as if to keep me from noticing how quickly her eyes darted behind me, checking whether anyone could see us. She led me inside and began listing chores before I had even set my suitcase down. Dad was lying in the recliner, grimacing occasionally, though when he saw me, he managed a stiff nod that passed for affection. He did not thank me for coming. He simply said it was good I could finally be useful. Then Nathan entered the room. He looked different, but also somehow exactly the same. Taller, broader, more sure of himself. The kind of confidence that grows when no one ever tells you no. He smiled at me in a way that made my stomach twist. Not warm, not brotherly. More like a coach assessing a player who had a lot of catching up to do. He said he was in the middle of training for a major qualification test, something he claimed would open doors for him in competitive sports coaching. Because of that, he needed the environment to stay calm and structured. Mom jumped in to say I should do my best not to disrupt anything. Nathan added that having me around would be a good opportunity for me to toughen up. I did not respond. I focused on my suitcase instead, suddenly wishing I had not unpacked anything that morning. Over the next few days, the patterns I thought adulthood had erased began to reappear. Mom asked me to cook, run errands, and handle tasks Dad could not manage. I tried to help willingly at first, but soon the requests became demands. Nathan floated in and out of rooms like he owned the air inside them, making comments about my posture, my pace, my breathing. Dad complained if I took too long at the store, or if dinner was not seasoned the way he liked. There were moments when the house fell perfectly quiet, and I felt like I was 11 years old again, trying not to make the wrong move, trying to stay invisible. I kept telling myself it was temporary. I kept telling myself it was only a few weeks. But deep down, something old and instinctive whispered that I had made a mistake. The house felt different in a way I could not explain. Nathan felt different too. Sharper, more intense, as if the version of him I remembered had evolved into something far more dangerous. I had returned home believing I could manage old wounds with adult distance. But on my very first night back as I lay in the bedroom I once escaped from, I realized the truth. I had not returned to help them. I had returned to a place that had always consumed me, and the moment I walked through the front door, the house knew it, and so did the... I had only been home for a few days when the familiar shadows of my childhood began creeping back into the corners of every room. They were subtle at first, small reminders of patterns I used to mistake for normal. But once I noticed the first sign, the rest began flooding in so quickly it felt like drowning all over again. Nathan started with comments. Not arguments, not outbursts. Just comments. Observations he called them. Evaluations. The type of statements that left no room for discussion. On my second morning back, I walked into the kitchen to make coffee. Nathan was already there, stretching, wearing workout clothes as if preparing for a competition that existed only in his mind. He looked me up and down, then asked why I always walked like I was tiptoeing through life. Before I could answer, he told me to lift my knees higher when I walked because my posture made me look small, and small people invited problems. He said it with a smile, but the kind of smile that was all teeth. Later that afternoon, I tried to carry a basket of laundry upstairs. Nathan stepped into the hallway and blocked my path, watching me struggle with the weight. When I tried to step around him, he took a half step to the side, mirroring my movement as if testing how I would react. He finally let me pass after a full 10 seconds, long enough to raise every alarm bell inside me. He called it reflex training. Mom called it Nathan being silly. I called it disturbing, though only in my head. One evening, Dad wanted his dinner earlier than expected. I was cooking because Mom said she had a headache. As I stood at the stove, Nathan walked in, sniffed the air, and said I was seasoning the food wrong. He grabbed the spoon from my hand before I could respond. He tasted the sauce, grimaced theatrically, and said I had no palate and probably never would. He leaned in so close I could feel his breath and said some people were born incapable of improving themselves. Dad chuckled. Mom said nothing. I told myself to shrug it off. I told myself everything was temporary. But the more I apologized or stayed quiet, the more empowered Nathan became. It only took a few days for him to escalate. One morning, when I was heading back to my room, Nathan stood in the hallway again. He said he wanted to test something. Before I could ask what, he lifted his hand and suddenly snapped his fingers near my face. I flinched. Not dramatically, just a natural reflex. He laughed. He tried again. I flinched again. I felt my cheeks burn. He said it proved I had no mental toughness. Dad walked past and said Nathan was trying to help me. Mom nodded as if the entire situation made sense. That night, when I tried to close my bedroom door, Nathan stopped it with his foot. He leaned against the doorway and asked why I always hid in my room, why I always acted like everyone was out to get me. I told him I needed rest. He said rest was for people who earned it. He said I should join him for his morning training. He said it would transform me. I said no. He stared at me with a look that made the air feel thin. The next morning, he woke me up at 6 by pounding on my door. He said if I skipped training, it showed I had no self-discipline. I said I was tired. He said people who were tired were simply weak. I wanted to ignore him, but when I cracked the door open to ask him to stop, he pushed past me into my room as if he owned it. He walked around inspecting everything, picking up books and placing them elsewhere, judging my organization. I felt 12 again, powerless watching him invade my space. Mom finally called him away because she needed help moving boxes. When he left, I locked the door, even though we were not allowed to lock doors in that house growing up. I leaned back against the wood and tried to slow my breathing. Every red flag I had forced myself to tolerate as a child was resurfacing with a sharper edge. At dinner that evening, Mom talked about how wonderful it was having everyone under the same roof. Dad boasted about how strong Nathan had become. Nathan smirked at me as if daring me to disagree. When I remained silent, Dad said silence was rude. When I spoke, Dad said my tone was off. There was no winning. I was never meant to win in that house. The worst sign came on the 4th day. I was brushing my teeth when Nathan appeared behind me in the mirror. I had not heard him enter. He asked if I trusted him. I said nothing. He asked again, louder, each word sharper. Before I could respond, he placed his hands on my shoulders, squeezed gently, and said, "Trust was the foundation of any healthy family." Then he leaned closer and said, "People like me always invited danger because we refused to grow stronger." I froze. It was the same tone he used minutes before he pushed me under the water days later. The tone that said he was not speaking from impulse, but intention. The tone that said he believed every word he was saying. That was when I began feeling watched in my own home. That was when every creak in the hallway made my stomach tighten. That was when I realized I had stepped back into a world where Nathan controlled the air, the space, the narrative, and my parents not only accepted it but encouraged it. They had spent years teaching him that he was right and I was wrong, that he was strong and I was weak, that he was someone to protect and I was someone to correct. The red flags were not new. They had simply been waiting for me to come home. The shift from harmless childhood games to something darker did not happen in a single moment. It crept in slowly like vines wrapping around a house until the structure underneath was barely visible. At first, Nathan's behavior seemed like exaggerated versions of the habits he had always had: competitive, demanding, overconfident. But the longer I stayed in that house, the more obvious it became that these were not games anymore. These were tests, challenges, exercises in dominance disguised as playful sibling banter. One afternoon, Mom asked me to help carry grocery bags inside. As I hauled the heavier ones up the steps, Nathan walked out to meet me. He stood at the door with his arms crossed, watching me struggle. Then he said he would time me. He pulled out his phone, pressed a button dramatically, and told me to show him how quickly I could finish. When I asked him to move so I could get through the doorway, he stepped aside only after making a comment about how my grip strength was embarrassing. Mom heard him but did not correct him. She laughed and said he was only teasing. Dad, sitting on the couch, told me to toughen up and stop acting sensitive. Later, when I tried to carry a basket of folded laundry upstairs, Nathan inserted himself into the moment again. He strutted down the hallway, arms swinging like he was on a mission, and challenged me to see who could reach the top first. Before I could tell him I was not interested, he pushed past me so hard, the basket nearly tipped from my arms. He called back over his shoulder that I was slow, predictable, always behind. I tried to ignore him, but the sting stayed with me all night. At dinner that evening, he took the last piece of chicken even though I had not eaten yet. When I reached for the salad, he slid the bowl away just as my fingers nearly touched it, smirking, like a boy who had snatched a toy just to watch someone cry. Dad chuckled. Mom told me to stop giving Nathan dirty looks. She said I should learn to take a joke. The next morning, I offered to help Dad sort through some papers he needed for his medical appointments. Nathan swept in before I finished the sentence. He took the documents from my hands and said loudly enough for Dad to hear that I was only going to mess them up. Dad did not defend me. Instead, he scolded me for interrupting Nathan's workflow. The insinuation that I was incompetent hung in the air, heavy and familiar. Nathan's energy grew more animated every time I stayed quiet. every time I swallowed my frustration, every time I let him win. He fed on it as though each surrender gave him permission to escalate. His favorite new game involved blocking my path. Sometimes it was the hallway, sometimes the kitchen, sometimes the entrance to my room. He would stand in the doorway with his arms stretched across the frame like a guard. He would smile and ask me questions in a light tone, but the look in his eyes was not playful. It was evaluative, analyzing how long it would take before I broke. If I tried to move around him, he mirrored my movements. If I asked him to step aside, he said I needed to learn how to assert myself. If I tried to walk away, he stepped closer. Mom insisted Nathan was teaching me life skills. Dad said he was pushing me the way good coaches push their athletes. They always framed his behavior as guidance, never aggression, and I always came out of it feeling smaller. One evening, everything crossed another invisible line. We were clearing the table after dinner. Nathan grabbed 2 stacks of plates while I carried the silverware tray. As we stepped into the kitchen, he challenged me again, asking who could finish cleaning first. I told him I did not want to play. I placed the tray on the counter and turned toward the sink. He stepped directly behind me, blocking any movement. His breath brushed against my hair as he said that life was a competition whether I liked it or not. Then he nudged me with his shoulder, pushing me into the counter harder than necessary. The edge pressed painfully into my hip. I sucked in a quick breath. Before I could react, he grabbed the faucet hose, sprayed water across the counter, and said I should clean it faster if I did not want to get soaked. When the spray hit the floor and splattered onto my clothes, Dad walked in. He took one look at the puddle, frowned at me, and said I needed to stop making a mess. Nathan laughed quietly behind him. That night, while brushing my teeth, I saw a bruise forming on my hip where the counter had struck me. I lifted my shirt slightly, tracing the red mark with my fingertip. It was not serious, but it was enough to confirm what I already knew. Nathan was not being playful. He was being territorial. He wanted control, and he was testing how far he could go. The games continued the next day, more extreme, more invasive. I dropped a glass while unloading the dishwasher, and before I could pick up the pieces, Nathan grabbed my wrist and said, "Clumsy people caused accidents that ruined whole households." He tightened his grip enough for me to feel the warning beneath the words. Mom walked in at that moment and scolded me for dropping the glass, ignoring the way Nathan's fingers dug into my skin. As the days passed, I began waking up with knots in my stomach, bracing for whatever new test Nathan would concoct. Every interaction felt strategic, as though he was mapping out my breaking points. My parents saw none of it. Or maybe they saw everything and chose to ignore it because acknowledging it would crack the foundation they had built their lives upon. To them, Nathan was still the golden son, the one whose flaws were lessons for others, and whose cruelty was simply tough love. And to them, I was still the child who needed shaping. The games that once ended in scraped knees or tears now carried an undercurrent of threat. And for the first time since returning home, I realized these games were not escalating by accident. Nathan was preparing for something, and he expected me to fail. The first real incident, the one I replayed in my mind again and again afterward, did not come out of nowhere. It was the natural progression of every smaller moment that led up to it, every test Nathan created every time my parents stood by and let him decide what counted as normal. It happened on a quiet afternoon when Mom had stepped out to pick up prescriptions and Dad was asleep in his recliner. The house felt unusually still, the kind of stillness that makes every sound echo just a little longer. I had spent the morning cleaning, doing laundry, and trying to keep out of Nathan's way. He disappeared into the basement gym for hours, making the floorboards vibrate with the thuds of his training equipment. I hoped he would stay there all day. I hoped for a lot of things back then. When I went upstairs to shower, I locked the bathroom door, even though locking doors was technically forbidden. I told myself it was for privacy, but really it was to create the smallest illusion of safety. The hot water felt like the first relief I had felt in days. I let it run over my shoulders, tried to breathe deeply, tried to convince myself that maybe I was overreacting to everything, that maybe Nathan was simply being himself, that maybe I could endure this visit without losing myself entirely. After I stepped out, I wrapped a towel around my shoulders and started wiping the steam from the mirror, hoping to see some version of myself that did not look so worn out. That was when I heard the door handle rattle. My stomach tightened. I said I was in the bathroom. The handle rattled again. Then suddenly, the sharp click of the lock sliding open. I froze. For a moment, I could not understand how it happened. Then, I remembered that Dad had installed an emergency release on the door years ago, a tiny mechanism on the outside frame that could pop the lock open with a coin or a small screwdriver. Nathan stepped inside as if walking into a gym, not a bathroom someone else was using. His face was flushed from working out. His shirt was damp against his chest. He looked at me with a familiar mix of amusement and evaluation. He said I should not rely on locks to protect me. I gripped the edge of the counter, feeling my heartbeat kick up. He moved past me casually, as if I were merely another object in the room. He turned on the bathtub faucet and let water fill the tub. I asked what he was doing. He said he wanted to show me something. His tone was calm, almost bored. I backed away slowly. He gestured toward the tub and said he wanted to demonstrate how pressure could change a person. He said real growth happened in discomfort. He said I spent my life avoiding challenges. I told him I did not want to participate in whatever he was planning. He smirked and said my resistance was exactly why I needed the lesson. I moved toward the door, but he stepped in front of me, blocking the exit. His body filled the space so completely that I felt the air shrink around me. I tried to stay calm, tried to reason with him, but every word made his expression sharpen. He said he was trying to help me. He said I should appreciate it. Then he stepped closer, so close I could see the flecks of sweat on his forehead. Without warning, he grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the bathtub. I tried to pull back, panic rising fast, but his grip tightened. The water had filled almost halfway. Steam rose from its surface, distorting the reflection of the bathroom lights. I begged him to stop. He said the begging was exactly the problem. He wrapped one arm around my waist and lifted me into the air as if I weighed nothing. A sound lodged in my throat, half gasp, half cry. He ignored it. The moment he lowered me into the water, everything inside me revolted. My feet slipped against the porcelain, my hands scrambled for the rim, and the towel around my shoulders dragged downward, heavy with water. His hand pressed firmly between my shoulder blades. I felt the shift in his weight before he pushed. My face submerged. The shock of the water stole every breath from my lungs. My eyes flew open, stinging. The roar in my ears drowned out everything else. Instinct took over, and I fought wildly, clawing at his arm, kicking against the tub, but his grip did not loosen. The water filled my nose, burning like fire. My hair floated around me, tangling against the current his movements created. My heartbeat thudded so hard, it felt like the entire room pulsed with it. Every second dragged out, long and merciless. I tried to lift my head, but he pushed me down harder. I felt my fingernails scrape the porcelain, felt the ache explode across my chest as my lungs begged for air. And then, through the water's distortion, I saw movement near the door. A shadow, 2 shadows. I could recognize their silhouettes anywhere. My parents, standing there, watching, just watching. They did not shout. They did not run to me. They did not demand Nathan stop. They did not even gasp. Nathan finally lifted my head above the water. I inhaled so sharply I felt my throat tear. I coughed violently, water spilling out of my mouth, my chest heaving. I collapsed against the side of the tub, gasping, blinking away the blur in my eyes. I looked at my parents, searching for outrage, fear, love, anything. Mom frowned at the puddle on the floor and said I was making a mess. Dad told me to calm down and take responsibility for my reactions. Nathan straightened, wiped a drop from his wrist, and said the lesson clearly did not work because I still panicked too easily. I sat trembling in the tub water, dripping from my hair, my lungs burning, the edges of the room spinning slightly. And in that moment, still choking on my own breath, I realized something that felt like a cold blade sliding into my spine. This was only the beginning. In the hours after the bathtub incident, I waited for someone in that house to acknowledge what had happened. I waited for anger, urgency, worry, anything resembling a normal human reaction to watching a daughter nearly drown. But in my family, reality was always something flexible, something that could be bent and twisted until it fit whatever version of the truth made them most comfortable. Gaslighting was not an event in that house. It was a language. And in the aftermath of the water incident, they spoke it fluently. After I changed clothes and wrapped myself in a blanket, I went downstairs still shaking. My hair was damp. My chest burned with every breath. My legs felt unsteady. Mom was in the kitchen wiping down the counter. She did not look up when I entered. When I finally managed to whisper that what happened upstairs wasn't okay, she set the cloth down slowly and sighed as if she were tired of rehearsing the same line. She said I always blew things out of proportion. She said Nathan was only trying to help me face my fears. I told her I did not have a fear of water. She said maybe I did without realizing it. I said he pushed me under. She said maybe I slipped. I said she saw it with her own eyes. She said I was being dramatic. Every sentence she spoke rewrote the scene into something more palatable for her, something easier than the truth. The more I protested, the more irritated she became. Then she told me to lower my voice because Dad was resting and my complaints would stress him out. When Dad woke up, he did not ask about my coughing or my shaking hands. He sat in his recliner, flipped through a sports channel, and when I approached him, he muted the TV slowly as if preparing himself to indulge a childish tantrum. I told him what happened. He did not blink. He said Nathan was preparing for an important exam and had a lot on his mind. I said that had nothing to do with what he did to me. He said people under pressure act strangely and that I should be understanding. I reminded him that Nathan held me underwater. He said holding someone underwater was not the same as trying to hurt them. I said I could have passed out. He shrugged and said I was old enough to control my breathing. He turned the TV volume back up. It felt like my words dissolved in the air before they reached him. Later that evening, I overheard my parents in the living room. Dad said I had always been overly sensitive. Mom said I liked playing the victim. Dad said I was making things harder than they needed to be. Mom said I should be grateful Nathan cared enough to challenge me. They talked about me as if I were a broken appliance they were trying to diagnose. I went back to my room and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, trying to piece together how people who were supposed to protect me could look at an attempted drowning and call it tough love. Nathan appeared at my doorway not long after. He did not knock. He leaned against the frame like he had every right to be there. I tensed. He smirked. He asked why I looked shaken. When I did not answer, he walked in, closed the door behind him, and sat on the edge of the desk chair like we were about to have a casual conversation. He said what happened earlier was necessary. He said I needed a wake-up call. He said life would crush me if I did not learn to withstand pressure. I told him none of what he did was normal. His eyebrows lifted in fake confusion. He asked why I always assumed the worst. He said that if he actually wanted to hurt me, I would know. His words were cold and deliberate. I asked why he did it. He tilted his head and said he wanted to see how long I could last, that it would give both of us information about what areas I needed to improve. Improve. As if I were a project, a weakness to be corrected. I told him to stay away from me. He laughed and said I was being sensitive again. He stood up, walked closer, and examined the red marks on his wrist where my nails had scraped his skin underwater. He called them unnecessary. He said I should apologize. I stared at him stunned. He asked again. I said nothing. He leaned in, lowering his voice to a whisper, and said, if the situation were reversed, he would have found the whole thing funny. Then he waited. He waited until my silence became suffocating. He waited until my instinct to survive collided with my instinct to appease. And then, because I did not know what else to do in that moment, I apologized. The second the word left my mouth, I regretted it. His smile widened. He said he accepted my apology and told me to remember that challenges were opportunities. After he walked out, I locked my door again even though I knew it would not stop him. I sat there feeling small and confused, replaying the moment when I had apologized to the person who held my head underwater. That was when the gaslighting truly burrowed in. It made me question my senses, my memory, my sanity. Maybe I had slipped. Maybe I had exaggerated. Maybe I was being dramatic. Maybe I was weak. The thoughts circled me like shadows, but beneath them, buried deep, something stubborn insisted that I was not wrong. Something inside me whispered that what happened was not normal, not safe, not loving, no matter how many times they tried to rewrite it. I went to sleep that night with my heart pounding against my ribs, a steady reminder of the truth I was trying not to forget. Something was very, very raw. In the days after the incident, the house seemed to grow smaller. Every room felt like it was shrinking around me, every hallway narrower, every shadow darker. I was living among people who watched me choke on bathwater without blinking. People who insisted it was my fault for reacting poorly. People who believed Nathan was a hero in his own story, and I was the complication he had to fix. The loneliness pressed on my chest like a weight. I needed help. I needed someone outside this house to tell me I was not losing my mind. But reaching out meant admitting the truth out loud, and part of me feared hearing my own voice say the words. Still on the third night after the incident, I dialed my closest friend, Harper. She and I had known each other since college. She had seen me stressed, tired, overwhelmed, but she had never seen me scared. When she answered, her voice was cheerful, talking about her recent weekend trip, the warm weather, the funny thing her coworker said. I listened quietly, waiting for a space to speak. When she noticed my silence, she finally paused and asked if something was wrong. I hesitated. I tried to explain gently, hoping she would understand without me having to paint every ugly detail. I told her I had returned home temporarily. I told her Nathan had been acting strangely. I told her there had been an incident involving water. She laughed lightly and said siblings do stupid things all the time. When I tried again clarifying that he held me underwater, she sucked in a breath but recovered quickly. She said maybe Nathan was trying to joke around and misjudged the moment. She said maybe he thought I could take it. She said maybe I misunderstood. Her tone was not cruel, but it was distant, uncertain, like she was trying to gently guide me back to a more reasonable interpretation of the situation. When I told her my parents saw everything and did nothing, she fell silent for several seconds. Then she asked if I was sure I did not slip. I felt something in my chest collapse. She said she knew I got anxious sometimes. She said maybe the pressure of being back home was affecting me. She said maybe Nathan made a mistake and felt bad. She said I should not assume the worst. By the end of the conversation, I felt more isolated than before I called. I hung up and sat on the floor of my childhood bedroom staring at the wall, listening to the faint vibrations of Nathan dropping weights in the basement. My hands shook. The silence burned. The next day, I tried reaching out to a coworker from the clinic, someone who had always been empathetic and kind. Her voice was soft when she answered. I told her I was visiting home, that things were strange, that an incident had happened. I tried again to describe it carefully, logically. She listened patiently, but kept asking questions that made me feel like I was overinterpreting everything. Did he mean it as a joke? Was he experimenting with training techniques? Was he showing me something about breath control? When I said he pushed me under long enough that my chest hurt for hours, she exhaled slowly and said, "Sometimes families communicate differently." She said I should try to see his intentions. She said maybe he felt responsible for helping me toughen up because I seemed stressed at work. The more she tried to rationalize it, the more I realized she could not imagine the twisted normal my family lived in. Her family was functional, loving, balanced. Mine was built on hierarchy. Hers was built on care. I ended the call quickly, embarrassed for even reaching out. I did not try calling anyone else that day, but that night I opened my laptop and searched online for signs of sibling abuse. The search results made me dizzy. Articles described patterns that matched mine exactly. Siblings who learned to dominate, parents who minimized everything, victims who grew up believing they were overreacting. I scrolled for hours, reading post after post from people who had lived my life without ever naming it. I wanted to message someone on a forum, but I froze, afraid the words would sound ridiculous written out. I closed the laptop. The next morning, while cleaning the kitchen, I heard footsteps behind me. Nathan walked in humming. I stiffened without meaning to. He noticed, of course. He always noticed. He asked who I had been talking to the night before. I told him no one. He smiled in that slow, knowing way and said I should be careful who I confided in because people would misunderstand him. He said outsiders always misread strong personalities. He said that if I told the story wrong, it might upset him. His tone was light, but the threat underneath made my stomach twist. I spent the rest of the day avoiding him, but avoiding him in that house was like trying to avoid oxygen. He appeared everywhere, at the top of the stairs, in the living room, in the hallway, in the kitchen doorway, watching me chop vegetables. Every time I walked past him, my skin prickled with the feeling of being observed. When I tried to take a walk outside that evening, Mom called after me and asked why I was acting secretive. She said Nathan was worried about me. She said my behavior was creating tension. I could barely respond. I walked down the neighborhood street until I reached the corner, then stood there staring at the pavement, feeling like the world had become a place where no one could hear me unless my words matched their expectations. I returned to the house with a heaviness in my chest and a realization I did not want to admit. No one was coming to save me. Not my parents, not my brother, not my friends, not even my colleagues. I was alone in a house full of people who insisted I was imagining danger while the person causing it became more confident by the day. And deep down, under all the noise of confusion and doubt, a thought formed like a small sharp stone. If no one else believed me, I would have to believe myself. But believing myself meant acknowledging that something far worse might be coming. The shift into real violence happened so subtly that at first I did not recognize what was happening. Nathan had always pushed boundaries, but the days following the water incident felt different. There was a new intensity in the way he moved, a new sharpness in his eyes, as if the moment he held me underwater awakened something in him. Something he liked. Something he wanted more of. It began with his training sessions. Nathan started holding them in the living room instead of the basement, claiming the air circulation was better upstairs. In reality, he wanted an audience. He wanted me to watch. He dropped heavy weights onto the floor with enough force to make the walls shudder. He grunted loudly, shouting through each rep as if performing for an invisible crowd. He critiqued every move I made in the kitchen while he trained, saying I stirred too softly, moved too slowly, breathed too shallowly. He said my posture made me an easy target in life. Every comment carried a thinly veiled message. I am stronger. You are weak. I am in control. You are not. Mom and Dad said nothing about the noise. They praised him for his discipline and complained that I looked inconvenienced. By the fourth day after the incident, Nathan no longer waited for opportunities to assert dominance. He created them. Late that afternoon, I tried to carry a basket of laundry upstairs. He appeared behind me without warning, making me jump. He looked at the basket and asked if I wanted help. I told him no. He smirked and said, refusing help did not make me independent, it made me foolish. Then he grabbed the basket from my hands so abruptly that it knocked into my stomach. I gasped and stepped back, nearly losing my balance. He accused me of stumbling on purpose to make him look bad. Mom walked into the hallway, saw me holding my stomach, and asked why I was being dramatic. Nathan stood there with the laundry basket like a hero who had offered assistance and been unfairly attacked. I wanted to scream. Instead, I whispered that everything was fine. Nathan's smile at that moment was cold. Later that night, when I tried to wash dishes, he came up behind me again. He nudged my elbow not hard enough to injure me, but hard enough to make me drop a plate. It shattered on the tile. The sound was so loud it made me flinch. Nathan said loudly that I always made unnecessary messes. Mom appeared instantly, saw the broken plate, and scolded me for being careless. I opened my mouth to explain, but Nathan cut me off, saying accidents like this were exactly why he worried about me living alone. Dad chimed in from the living room, saying some people needed constant supervision. I felt myself shrinking with every word. But the worst escalation came 2 days later when the house was unusually quiet. Mom was out grocery shopping. Dad had gone for a walk, though he was still supposedly recovering. Nathan found me wiping down the counter. He leaned against the doorway and said he wanted to try a reaction drill. I told him no. He stepped closer and said running from challenges made people weak. I backed away from him, but there was nowhere to go. The kitchen had only one exit, and he stood in it. I held the dish towel tightly, my pulse rising. I asked him again to let me pass. He took a slow step toward me and said he wanted to test something. I felt my mouth go dry. I said I did not want to play his games. His eyes darkened. He said it was not a game. Then, without warning, he grabbed my wrist and twisted it behind my back. Not enough to break anything, but enough to make pain bloom through my arm. I gasped. He said it was a self-defense drill. He said I had terrible reflexes. He said he was training me. Every time I tried to pull away, he tightened his grip just enough to make the pain spike. My breath became shallow. My vision blurred slightly at the edges. He leaned in close, his voice low and steady, saying he could not believe how unprepared I was for life. I struggled again and finally managed to wrench my arm free. He let go abruptly, pushing me forward, so I stumbled into the counter. Pain shot up my hip. I turned around, breathless, shaking. He stared at me with an expression I had never seen before. Something like triumph, something like hunger. He said if that drill had been real, I would be on the ground by now. I could not find my voice. When I finally stepped around him to leave the kitchen, he grabbed my shoulder, spun me slightly, and asked why I always looked scared. He said fear made me a liability. A liability. I pushed past him, ignoring the tremor in my legs. As I reached the hallway, I heard him laugh quietly. The kind of laugh that said he had discovered a new power, a new button he could press whenever he wanted. That evening, I kept to my room with the door locked. Every footstep in the hallway made me flinch. Every creak of the old house made me hold my breath. I stared at the bruise forming on my wrist, a dark reminder of how far things had escalated. Nathan knocked once, gently, almost politely. Then he said through the door that we would try a new drill tomorrow. My body went cold. Mom called me down for dinner later. I forced myself to appear. If I stayed hidden, it would raise questions none of them would ask out of concern, but out of irritation. At the table, Nathan acted cheerful. He told Dad he had been making progress on his training. Dad praised him. Mom smiled like she was proud. When I reached for my glass of water, my hand shook slightly. Dad noticed and asked if I was nervous about something. Mom said maybe I was tired from lack of exercise. Nathan looked at me with deliberate calm and said he could help me with that. The room spun. I excused myself early. As I walked back to my room, I felt the truth settle heavily in my chest. He was not just testing boundaries anymore. He was expanding them, and he was waiting patiently for the moment I stopped fighting back. The moment Mrs. Hawthorne entered my life was so ordinary at first that I did not realize how much it would change everything. It happened on a Wednesday afternoon after a morning filled with tension so thick it felt like breathing through cloth. Nathan had been pacing around the house as if searching for an excuse to start another session. Mom kept complaining that I was making the atmosphere uncomfortable. Dad muttered under his breath about people who brought negativity into a home. Every sound, every footstep, every rustle of movement put me on edge. By noon, I had a pounding headache and my nerves felt scraped raw. I tried stepping outside for fresh air, just a few minutes on the front porch, just enough to calm my shaking hands. The sunlight felt foreign on my skin, like something I was no longer allowed to experience without permission. I stood there hugging myself, staring at the quiet street, when I heard the front door open behind me. Nathan stepped out, his voice dripping casual authority. He asked where I thought I was going. I said I just needed some air. He stepped closer and said fresh air did not fix weakness. His tone was sharp enough to make my stomach twist. I backed up instinctively. He followed his posture loose but predatory. Then he said we should continue where we left off because he had another drill in mind. Panic surged through my chest. I told him no. He said I did not understand how training worked. I stepped back until my back touched the porch railing. His eyes flickered with something dark, something curious, something that made the skin on my arms prickle. And then it happened. A voice called out from across the street, a firm, older, no-nonsense voice. Mrs. Hawthorne's voice. She was standing on her driveway holding a bag of potting soil, staring at us with narrowed eyes. She asked if everything was all right. Nathan immediately straightened a smile snapping onto his face like a mask. He said everything was fine. He said we were just talking. She tilted her head slightly, assessing him with an expression I would later learn was her version of suspicion. She held eye contact with Nathan for several seconds, then turned to me. Her gaze softened. She asked if I needed anything. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. My throat tightened. Nathan answered for me, saying I was dramatic sometimes, but completely fine. He chuckled like it was a harmless family quirk. Mrs. Hawthorne's expression did not change. She kept her eyes on me, waiting. Nathan stepped forward, slightly blocking her line of sight. She stepped forward, too. I finally forced out a small, shaky, "I'm okay." She did not look convinced. She lingered a moment longer, then walked back into her house, but not before giving me a look that said she had noticed something. A seed was planted in that moment. A seed Nathan did not see. That evening, just after sunset, I was wiping down the kitchen counter when a knock sounded at the front door. Mom called for me to answer it because she was busy rearranging a decorative shelf. I opened the door and found Mrs. Hawthorne standing there with a casserole dish covered in foil. She said she made too much dinner and thought we might like some. Her tone was polite, but her eyes were inspecting me closely. She asked if she could come in for a moment. I hesitated, glanced toward the living room, then stepped aside. She entered slowly, as if trying to absorb every detail of the house. When she saw Nathan lounging on the couch, she gave a tight smile. Mom came over all cheerful greetings and forced politeness, thanking her for being such a thoughtful neighbor. Mrs. Hawthorne set the casserole on the counter, then turned to me and asked if I could help her carry something from her car. Nathan began to rise as if to accompany us, but she raised her hand and said she needed a woman's opinion. Something in her tone made him sink back into the couch. The moment we stepped outside, her demeanor changed. She asked me quietly if I felt safe. The question hit me like a blow to the sternum. I froze, the night air suddenly too cold. She turned fully toward me, her eyes intense but gentle. She said she had once ignored signs in her own home. She said she lost her daughter because she trusted the wrong explanations. She said the way I flinched earlier reminded her of that time. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to speak. I wanted to tell her everything, but fear clamped down on my voice. She noticed. She softened again, telling me I did not need to say anything now. She said I could knock on her door anytime, day or night, and she would answer. She said victims rarely get second chances, and she was not going to let me slip through the cracks. My eyes stung. I blinked rapidly, shaking my head, insisting I was fine. She touched my arm gently, careful not to startle me, and said she hoped that someday I would trust her with the truth. She asked if I was eating well. I wanted to laugh. Instead, I nodded. She sighed, studying the house behind me like it was a threat disguised as suburban normalcy. Before she left, she slipped a small card into my hand. Her cell number, her home number, and her words written on the bottom. "If you are scared, come to me." After she drove away, I stood outside for several minutes, clutching the card like a lifeline. For the first time since returning home, I felt something unfamiliar. Hope. Not enough to feel safe, not enough to feel brave, but enough to feel slightly less alone. Inside the house, the walls still felt tight and the shadows still felt heavy. But somewhere across the street, a door was open. A stranger had noticed, and she was watching. Not the way Nathan watched, but the way someone watches a storm forming and knows exactly what destruction it can bring. The unraveling began the next morning, though, if I were honest, the threads had been loosening for years. It started with something small, something deceptively ordinary. I woke early, hoping to avoid Nathan before he began his daily rituals of discipline and control. The house was quiet, unusually so. I walked into the kitchen and found Mom sitting at the table with her coffee, staring at her phone. Her expression was tight, her shoulders rigid. When she looked up and saw me, her eyes flashed with something sharp and unmistakable. Accusation. She asked me why Mrs. Hawthorne had been lingering yesterday. Her tone was already rising, already rehearsing anger she planned to unleash. I said she had dropped off dinner. Mom set her mug down hard enough to splash coffee onto the table. She asked if I had said something inappropriate to that woman. My stomach twisted. I said no. She leaned back, crossing her arms, and said the neighbor got the impression something was wrong inside the house. She asked me what I had done to cause that. Not what Nathan had done, not what she had ignored. What I had done. Before I could respond, Dad entered the kitchen, rubbing his temples like he was preparing for an exhausting battle. He said he heard there had been an incident with the neighbor. Incident. That word again. A catch-all container for every truth they wanted to compress into something manageable. I told them nothing happened. Dad's voice rose instantly. He said neighbors did not randomly ask if everything was okay unless someone was stirring things up. Mom chimed in, saying she had lived in this neighborhood for 20 years without issues. Then she leaned forward and said something that made my hands go cold. She said I was embarrassing them. I tried to steady my breathing. I tried to explain that I had not said anything, that Mrs. Hawthorne simply noticed I was upset. Dad slammed his hand on the table. He said I needed to learn how to behave, how to present the family properly, how to stop drawing attention. He said people would think we were unstable. Mom followed his lead, her voice trembling with anger. She said stress made me exaggerate. She said I had always had a flair for dramatics. She said I must have done something to alert the neighbor. I said quietly that maybe Mrs. Hawthorne noticed something because something was wrong. Silence hit the room like a dropped plate. Dad stared at me with disbelief, then contempt. Mom's mouth tightened, and then everything broke open. Mom launched into a tirade, her voice rising higher with every sentence. She said I was selfish to suggest anything was wrong with Nathan. She said Nathan had been working hard his entire life, carrying the family's hopes, dealing with pressure I could not comprehend. She said he had always protected me, always looked out for me. Protected. The word stung like alcohol on an open wound. I shook my head and said what he did was not protection. Dad leaned in and said I should stop twisting harmless actions into attacks. He said Nathan had been trying to make me stronger. He said I was incapable of understanding tough love. Mom added that if anyone was in danger of harming the family, it was me. My eyes burned. Something inside me cracked. I told them what happened in the bathroom. Really told them. Every detail, every second, every sound. Dad stood up so abruptly, his chair scraped the floor. He said I needed to stop lying. I said they saw it. Mom pointed a shaking finger at me and said what she saw was a clumsy girl slipping underwater and blaming her brother. Her voice was venomous now, the kind that only appears when denial is the only thing holding someone's world together. The anger escalated quickly like gasoline poured onto something already smoldering. Dad accused me of trying to ruin Nathan's career. Mom said maybe I came home because I failed at my job and needed attention. I felt like I was shrinking, suffocating, disappearing into the air they were poisoning with their words. Then came the moment that pulled everything into sharp, brutal clarity. Dad stepped forward and said if I kept spreading lies, he would send a message to my former workplace making sure they knew I was unstable. My heart dropped. I asked what he meant. Mom said she had already drafted an email expressing concern about my emotional state. Dad nodded and said if I insisted on creating chaos, they would protect Nathan the way any good parents protect their promising child. I felt the floor tilt beneath me. I had seen them minimize my pain. I had seen them defend Nathan. I had seen them twist the truth. But this was different. This was an attack. A deliberate, calculated attack. I whispered that they were punishing the wrong person. Mom laughed short and cruel and asked when I had ever taken responsibility for anything. Dad then said something that took whatever air was left in my lungs. He said if I continued this narrative, he would make sure no employer trusted me again. My knees almost buckled. They were not just protecting Nathan. They were erasing me. They were burning down my life to keep his spotless. At that moment, I understood what Mrs. Hawthorne had meant the night before. I understood how people lose themselves in homes like this, how victims disappear long before they ever escape. I walked upstairs to my room, each step heavy with disbelief. Behind me, my parents were still muttering, still blaming me for everything unraveling. Their voices followed me like smoke. When I closed my bedroom door, my hands trembled so violently I had to sit on the edge of the bed to steady them. My family was no longer just pretending nothing was wrong. They were actively destroying me to protect the son they worshipped. And as devastating as that realization was, another truth began forming beneath it. If this was how far they would go, I needed to go further. I needed to survive them. I needed to get out. That night, the house felt wrong in a way I had no language for. I kept telling myself to breathe, to stay calm, to stay invisible until I figured out what to do. I lay on my bed fully dressed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the air conditioner and the occasional creak of the hallway floorboards. My door was closed, but it never felt like a barrier. Not in this house. Not with Nathan in it. I kept replaying the confrontation from earlier like a looping nightmare, their words coming back sharper each time. Selfish, dramatic, unstable, liar. The email to my workplace felt like a cage tightening around me. Nathan's smirk during the argument kept flashing through my mind, as if he had been waiting for everything to crumble so he could step into the space it left behind. At some point, the exhaustion became too heavy to fight. I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I knew, I woke to a soft, almost imperceptible sound. A click. A shift of weight. The sense of another presence. My eyes opened, and for a moment I could not understand what I was seeing. Nathan was standing in the doorway, the hallway light behind him turning him into a dark silhouette. My heart slammed painfully, as if it knew something my mind had not caught up to yet. I sat up slowly and asked what he was doing. He did not answer. He stepped inside, closing the door with a quiet decisiveness that chilled me to the bone. The click of the latch sounded final. He still did not speak, and the silence pressed against my chest. He held something in his hand. It was his phone. I recognized the case. He lifted it slightly as if to show me, then let it drop loosely to his side again. When he finally spoke, his voice was disturbingly calm. He said he wanted to clear something up before things got out of hand. I forced myself to ask what he meant. He walked closer, and I instinctively pulled my knees up toward my chest, trying to make myself smaller. He noticed. He smirked. He said he had been thinking about everything I had been saying lately. He said I had been acting out, making trouble, making everyone uncomfortable. And then he said something that made my skin go cold. He said he had been checking my room earlier and noticed I had been moving things, hiding things, maybe even recording things. He said if I ever tried to paint him as dangerous to anyone outside the family, he would make sure I regretted it. I said I had not recorded anything. My voice shook, betraying me. He tilted his head, studying my face like he could read every lie I had never told. Then he lifted the phone again and said it did not matter whether I had recordings. What mattered was that people believed him, not me. What mattered was that Mom and Dad trusted him completely. He said one word from him, one hint that I was unstable, and they would make sure my life fell apart faster than I could imagine. He stepped even closer, leaning down so our faces were almost level. I could smell toothpaste and the faint scent of gym deodorant. It made me nauseous. He whispered that I needed to stop telling stories. He said if I wanted peace in this house, I needed to stay quiet. Then he added something that made me freeze entirely. He said it would be a shame if something slipped online about my breakdowns, or if someone posted a video of me acting paranoid. He said he had ways to make people believe what he wanted them to believe. I whispered that he would never do that. He smiled in a way I had never seen before. He said I had no idea what he would do if pushed. He reached out suddenly and grabbed my wrist. Not to hurt me, not exactly. It was more like a demonstration, a reminder that he had before, that no one had stopped him then and no one would stop him now. His grip tightened gradually, painfully slow until I gasped. He leaned in and said if I ever told Mrs. Hawthorne or anyone else about what happened in the bathroom, he would make sure the world saw me as unstable. He said he could ruin my reputation before I even knew what was happening. He said he knew people who worked in local youth programs, people who trusted him, people who would believe whatever he told them. He said if I ever tried to turn the narrative against him, he would flip it back twice as hard. My pulse raced until I felt dizzy. I told him to let go. He held my wrist another second, making sure the bruise would form later, then released me with a casual shrug like it had been nothing. He walked toward the door, paused, and looked back at me. He said if I tried anything stupid, he would know. He said he always knew. Then he left, closing the door behind him. I sat frozen on the bed for a long time. My breath shallow and uneven, my wrist throbbing where his fingers had pressed into my skin. I knew then that I was not safe. Not with him. Not with them. Not in this house. For years, I had convinced myself the danger was subtle, emotional, corrosive. But now it was physical and explicit. a threat spoken aloud in a locked bedroom. Something inside me shifted with terrifying clarity. If I stayed, something irreversible would happen. I would become another tragedy people whispered about, another headline, another woman who never got away. I pressed my shaking hands together and whispered to myself that I needed a plan. I needed help. I needed to get out, and I needed to disappear before Nathan made good on his promise to destroy me. By the time the first hint of dawn brushed against my window, my decision had hardened into something absolute. I had not slept after Nathan left my room. I sat curled against the wall for hours, listening to every creak and shift of the house, terrified he might come back. Every sound made my pulse spike. Every shadow looked like him. When the sky outside began to lighten, I knew I had to move before the house woke. I eased off the bed, my wrist still throbbing from his grip, and stepped carefully across the floor, avoiding the spots that creaked. I pulled on the hoodie I had worn earlier, shoved my phone into my pocket, and quietly opened the top drawer of my desk. My hands shook as I took out a pen and a torn page from an old notebook. I had already decided what to write. It was the only message I trusted to leave behind. Mrs. Hawthorne, I need help. Please knock twice at 6 a.m. I will come out if it is safe. Please. I slid the note under the rug by my door, right against the crack where she would see it if she came looking. For a moment, fear made me falter. What if she did not come? What if Nathan woke early? What if Mom or Dad found the note first? But I pushed those thoughts down because hesitation was no longer a luxury I had. I crept over to my backpack and stuffed in the few things I could carry: a change of clothes, my medication, my wallet, and the photo of me at my college graduation. The one moment in my life I had fully earned without Nathan overshadowing me. I looked around the room one last time, the familiar walls suddenly feeling like the shell of a prison. I whispered to myself that I was not coming back. Seconds stretched into eternities as I waited by the door, crouched beside the rug, straining to hear any movement outside. At 5:57 a.m., the house was still. At 5:58 a.m., a car door shut quietly outside. My breath caught. At exactly 6:00 a.m., there were two soft knocks on the front door. Not Mom's impatient rhythm. Not Dad's heavy thump. Two careful, deliberate knocks. My chest tightened with relief, so sharp it felt like pain. I moved quickly but silently, pulling up the rug and sliding the door open just an inch. The hallway was empty. The house remained still. I slipped out one foot, then the other, and pulled the door closed behind me without a sound. As I stepped into the foyer, I saw her through the glass panel. Mrs. Hawthorne stood with her coat pulled tight, her hair slightly undone like she had rushed over. Her eyes widened with immediate understanding when she saw me. She motioned for me to come quickly. I stepped onto the porch, and the morning air hit me like freedom and terror all at once. She whispered, asking if I had everything I needed. I nodded, unable to speak through the tightness in my throat. She took my backpack from me to lessen the noise and guided me down the steps to her car. But before we reached it, a sound cracked through the air, a door slamming open, Nathan's voice shouting my name. I froze. Mrs. Hawthorne grabbed my wrist and pulled with surprising strength. She told me not to look back. I heard him behind us, the pounding of his footsteps hitting the porch, the anger in his voice rising like a wildfire. He yelled that I was being dramatic, that I needed to come back, that I was ruining everything. I ran. Not elegantly, not bravely. I ran the way someone runs who knows what happens if they are caught. We reached the car just as Nathan reached the bottom of the porch steps. He sprinted toward us, shouting, demanding, stop accusing me of manipulating the neighbor. He slammed his hand against the rear passenger door just as Mrs. Hawthorne shoved me inside. The impact shook the whole car. She shouted at him to back away. He cursed at her, raising his fist like he might hit the window. But then the Ring camera on her porch beeped a familiar chirp. He froze. That camera had recorded everything. His threatening posture, his attempt to block me, his aggression. Mrs. Hawthorne yanked open her driver's door and yelled through the cracked window that if he touched the car again, she would call the police. His face twisted with fury, but he stepped back, breathing hard, shaking with the anger he no longer knew how to hide. She started the engine, and I heard the grind of gravel beneath the tires as she peeled out of the driveway. My breath came in sharp, uneven bursts. I pressed my forehead to my knees, shaking uncontrollably. She placed a steady hand on my shoulder and told me I was safe now. I do not remember much of the drive. My mind was a blur of fear and disbelief, like my brain had shut down every system except survival. When we reached her house, she ushered me inside, locked the door, engaged the deadbolt, then pulled the curtains closed. Only then did I let myself cry. Not the silent crying I had perfected over the years, but real sobs that shook my entire body. She held me the way a mother should hold a child who has been fighting for too long. She whispered that she believed me, that I did the right thing, that I was safe here as long as I needed to be. When I finally caught my breath, she told me she was calling the police. She said what happened was not a misunderstanding or a sibling dispute. It was a threat, a real one, a legally actionable one. I nodded slowly. For the first time, I felt the tiniest ember of stability, not safety yet, but the possibility of safety, the possibility of a future that did not involve tiptoeing around my brother's rage or my parents' denial. As she made the call, I stared at the locked door, shaking, realizing something simple and enormous. I got out. I actually got out. The first hours after escaping felt unreal, like I had slipped into a different version of my life without warning. I sat on Mrs. Hawthorne's couch, wrapped in a blanket she insisted I take, staring at the steaming mug of tea in my hands. I could feel its warmth, but none of it reached my skin. My fingers trembled too much to sip it. My brain kept replaying the sound of Nathan's fist hitting the car door, the way his voice cracked with fury, the look on his face when he realized the Ring camera had captured everything. The police officer who came to take the initial report spoke gently, but every question made me flinch. Did he threaten you? Did he follow you? Has there been a pattern of escalating behavior? I answered as best as I could, though my throat felt too tight, my voice too thin. When the officer left, saying someone would follow up soon, a strange quiet settled over the room. Not peace, not safety, just quiet. And inside that quiet, my mind began to unravel in ways I had not prepared for. My whole body felt alert, like every sense had been turned up so high it hurt. I kept jumping at soft sounds at the creak of the old house, settling at the rumble of cars passing outside. I kept checking the windows, terrified I would see Nathan standing on the sidewalk waiting, watching. Mrs. Hawthorne noticed and gently closed the blinds, reassuring me that he did not know her address. She said even if he figured it out, the police would be here before he could try anything. I nodded, but the terror did not listen. It lived under my skin. That night, she set up a guest room for me, placing fresh sheets on the bed and setting a lamp on the nightstand. She told me to rest, but the moment she left the doorway, panic closed around my chest. The room was too quiet, too dark, too unfamiliar. I lay down anyway, pulling the blanket to my chin, staring at the ceiling. I kept hearing water, imagined drowning, imagined hands pushing me under again. My breath quickened until it was barely breath at all. I sat up, pressing a hand to my sternum, trying to force air into my lungs. Mrs. Hawthorne must have heard me pacing because she knocked softly and asked if she could come in. When she stepped inside, she saw the panic on my face and guided me to sit on the edge of the bed. She placed her hand over mine and told me to breathe with her, matching her rhythm. She spoke quietly, telling me I was safe here, telling me the door was locked, telling me she would not let anyone hurt me. Her calmness anchored me. Slowly the trembling eased. I apologized, my voice cracking. She shook her head firmly and said there was nothing to apologize for. Then she told me something she had never shared before. She said she lost her daughter because she ignored early signs of abuse. She said if someone had helped her daughter leave even one day earlier, maybe she would still be alive. She looked at me with eyes full of grief and determination and said she would not make that mistake again. Hearing her say that grounded me in a way nothing else had. This woman did not see me as dramatic or unstable. She saw danger where there was danger. She saw isolation where there was isolation. She saw me. Over the next few days, the adrenaline that had carried me out of the house crashed brutally. I alternated between shaking and numbness. Sometimes I felt too much. Sometimes I felt nothing at all. I slept in short, broken stretches interrupted by nightmares of being held underwater, of gasping for air, of Nathan opening the door to the guest room. Whenever I woke up gasping, Mrs. Hawthorne was there within seconds, as if she had been listening for any sign I needed her. During the day, I tried to function, but even simple things felt overwhelming. A faucet running too loudly made my heart pound. The sight of a brother and sister walking past the window made my stomach twist. The smell of soap in the bathroom made me break down entirely. I ate only because she encouraged me, gently telling me trauma lived in the body and I needed strength. Sometimes she sat with me at the kitchen table while I stared blankly at my untouched plate. Sometimes she talked to distract me. Sometimes she said nothing and simply sat beside me so I would not feel alone. And despite everything, guilt crept in. I felt guilty for leaving, guilty for calling her, guilty for taking space in her home, guilty for needing so much. I apologized one afternoon, my voice barely above a whisper. She put her fork down and turned to me with such seriousness that it startled me. She said I had spent my entire life apologizing for surviving. She said I had been conditioned to believe my pain was an inconvenience. She said that belief was wrong, completely unforgivably wrong. Her words cracked something in me. I cried at the table while she rubbed circles on my back. She told me healing was not linear. She told me there was no timeline. She told me safety needed time to grow roots. She kept reminding me that trauma did not vanish just because I changed locations. Even when I began to feel moments of calm, they were brief and fragile. If someone knocked on the door unexpectedly, I froze. If a male voice sounded on the television, my shoulders tensed. If I heard water running in the sink, I had to leave the room. But through all of this, Mrs. Hawthorne stayed beside me, patient and unwavering. Slowly, the sense of danger loosened its grip, though it never fully released. Not yet. One night, as she brewed tea for both of us, I asked her how long it took her daughter to feel safe after leaving. She looked out the window for a long time before answering. She said safety did not come all at once. It came in layers. She said the first layer was simply getting away. The second was realizing you had the right to stay away. The third was believing the danger could not follow you forever. Then she looked at me and said I had already survived the most difficult layer. I had left. Hearing that felt like taking my first real breath in days. I realized I did not feel safe yet, but for the first time I believed I could be. The morning I finally agreed to speak with a lawyer felt both terrifying and strangely empowering, as if two contradictory worlds were pulling me in opposite directions. I sat at Mrs. Hawthorne's kitchen table with a cup of tea growing cold in front of me while she made the call. I listened to her confident tone, the way she spoke clearly and firmly about scheduling a consultation, and I wondered how someone could sound that steady in the face of something so overwhelming. When she hung up, she squeezed my hand and said the attorney could meet us that afternoon. My hands trembled at the thought. I had spent my whole life being told that what happened to me did not matter, that I was exaggerating, that I was emotional, that I was breaking the family. Now someone was asking to hear my story. Someone whose job was to believe victims, not silence them. As we drove to the law office, the world outside the window blurred. Houses, trees, people walking their dogs. Everything looked shockingly normal compared to the chaos in my body. My pulse felt uneven, skittish. My breathing came too fast. Mrs. Hawthorne kept both hands on the steering wheel and told me to focus on the road lines to ground myself. When we arrived, my legs felt heavy as if I were walking underwater again. But the moment we stepped inside and the receptionist smiled gently at me, I felt something shift. The fear did not disappear, but it loosened just enough for me to breathe. The attorney was a calm, middle-aged woman with soft eyes and a voice that felt like a life raft. She invited us into her office and asked if I wanted Mrs. Hawthorne to sit in. I nodded immediately. I did not trust myself not to fall apart alone. Once we were settled, the attorney said she had reviewed the initial police report and the summary from the officer who visited the neighbor's house. She asked me to tell her everything in my own words. I took a shaky breath and began from the beginning. Not just the bathroom incident, but the years before. The favoritism, the humiliation, the way Nathan's competitiveness had turned into something darker, the gaslighting, the escalation, the threats in my bedroom, the escape, the way he chased me, the moment he slammed his fist into the car door, the camera footage. Every detail felt like a stone I had carried for too long. As I spoke, there were moments when my voice cracked, and moments when I could not breathe, but I did not stop. For the first time, someone was listening without interrupting, without accusing, without twisting the narrative into something convenient. When I finished, the attorney leaned forward slightly and said with a firmness that steadied me that what happened to me was serious and absolutely qualified as domestic violence under state law. My head snapped up. Domestic violence! I had never applied that label to my life. I had thought domestic violence belonged to other people, people whose stories were more dramatic or obvious. But hearing her say it made one truth settle deep into my chest. What he did was real. What he did was violence. And what I survived was not my imagination. The attorney explained that we needed evidence to support a restraining order and potentially file criminal charges. She began listing what she needed, and I felt overwhelmed all over again. She asked if Mrs. Hawthorne had the ring camera footage saved. Mrs. Hawthorne nodded. She asked if I had photographed the bruises Nathan left on my wrist. My stomach tightened as I admitted I had not. She told me it was not too late. Bruises change, but they still tell the story. She asked if I had any voice memos, any messages, any proof of threats. I shook my head, feeling suddenly ashamed. She quickly reassured me that the burden was not on victims to document their trauma perfectly. Then she asked the question I had hoped she would not ask. She asked if I still had access to the emails my parents sent my old workplace. My breath caught. I nodded slowly and told her they were in my inbox. She said those emails were powerful evidence because they showed coordinated psychological harm and retaliation aimed at discrediting me. She said judges paid attention to patterns, not just incidents. She asked for screenshots, copies, anything I could gather. Then she said something I will never forget. She said my family's attempt to destroy my professional credibility was not only cruel, it was legally relevant. It showed intention, malice, patterned behavior, and it could help protect me now. For the first time, the damage my parents had caused might actually help save me. That thought hurt and relieved me at the same time. After the attorney finished outlining the plan, she asked if I felt ready to proceed with filing for a restraining order. My mouth went dry. I knew that piece of paper would not stop Nathan's rage. I knew restraining orders were ignored every day. I knew the idea of provoking him terrified me, but the alternative was worse. Staying silent meant giving him control again. Staying silent meant letting him decide my life. So I nodded and said yes. She walked me through the process. She said there would likely be a temporary emergency order issued within hours. She said Nathan would be served with paperwork that he would know immediately that I had taken legal action and that this was often when abusers escalated. My chest tightened with fear, but she assured me that law enforcement took that stage seriously. She said staying with the neighbor who believed me put me in a safer position than most victims who had no one. Then she asked if I wanted to pursue criminal charges for assault, intimidation, and harassment. I hesitated. The idea of pressing charges against my own brother made me nauseous even after everything. She watched the conflict on my face and said softly that I did not have to decide today. She said survival came first, justice came second, and trauma was allowed to slow everything down. On the drive home, I stared straight ahead, absorbing everything. My fear had not disappeared, but something new had begun to grow beside it. Resolve. Not strength exactly, but the seed of it. A beginning. The day of the hearing felt like the air itself was vibrating. I barely slept the night before, waking every hour with the same looping fear that Nathan would show up at the neighbor's house, that he would break in, that he would find me before I ever made it to court. But morning came and Mrs. Hawthorne drove us downtown, her hands steady on the wheel while mine trembled uncontrollably in my lap. I had imagined courtrooms from television shows, big dramatic rooms with imposing judges and rows of spectators. The actual room was smaller, quieter, almost plain. But the moment I stepped inside, my chest tightened as if the walls were closing in. Nathan was already there. He stood on the opposite side with his arms crossed, jaw-stiff eyes burning into me with a mixture of fury and theatrical disbelief. My parents sat behind him, Mom gripping her purse so tightly her knuckles were white. Dad stiff and glaring at me like I had committed some grotesque betrayal by simply surviving. Mrs. Hawthorne guided me to our seats, one hand lightly on my back, grounding me. The attorney arrived moments later and gave me a reassuring nod. Then the judge entered, an older woman with an expression that broke no nonsense. The hearing began quickly. The judge looked at Nathan first, then at me, then at the paperwork in front of her. She asked my attorney to present our evidence. My stomach nodded. The attorney approached the bench and handed over a neatly organized folder. She began with the ring camera footage. The judge watched on a large monitor as the grainy video played. The front porch appeared first, the frame slightly tilted but clear enough to capture everything. Me stumbling toward the car. Mrs. Hawthorne pulling me forward. Nathan bursting out the door behind us. Nathan running after me. Nathan shouting my name. Nathan slamming his fist against the car door so hard the metal dented inward. The sound was loud even through the speakers, and the judge's eyebrow lifted sharply. My mother shifted uncomfortably in her seat. My father looked down. Nathan stared at the screen with an expression that flickered between rage and embarrassment. When the video ended, the room felt heavier. My attorney moved on to the photos she had taken of my bruises. They appeared next on the monitor. Dark fingerprints blooming along my wrist where Nathan had grabbed me days before. The judge leaned closer to the screen, studying them. Then came the email my parents had sent to my former workplace. The courtroom grew utterly silent as the attorney read it aloud. My mother's voice echoed in the words. Concerns about emotional instability. Concerns about erratic behavior. Concerns about my reliability as an employee. The attorney emphasized how the email had been sent on the same day I escaped the house, just hours after Nathan chased me. The judge looked at my parents. Mom stared at her lap. Dad stared straight ahead, jaw working tightly. My mother whispered something to him, but he did not look at her. Then the attorney submitted my written statement about the bathroom incident. As she read it, my skin prickled with cold. The memory felt too vivid, too present, like I was being dragged back into the water. She read how Nathan held me under until my lungs burned, how my parents stood in the doorway and did nothing, how I was forced to apologize afterward. Nathan scoffed loudly. The judge snapped her eyes toward him. She asked him if he had something he wished to say. Nathan said I was exaggerating. He said it had been a joke. He said I slipped. He said he had tried to catch me, but the judge had already watched the video of him chasing me. She had already seen the bruises. She had already read the email. She asked why he had run after me if the situation had been a joke. Nathan stammered. He said he wanted to make sure I was okay. The judge asked why he hit the car door. Nathan had no answer. The judge asked my mother why she had emailed my workplace. Mom stuttered something about being worried. The judge asked her why she had chosen to report her concern only after I fled the home. Mom said nothing. Then the judge asked my father if he believed the email was appropriate. He hesitated, then mumbled something about protecting family. The judge set the papers down and removed her glasses. The room held its breath. She said that what she had seen did not reflect concern. It reflected coercion. It reflected intimidation. It reflected a household where control had replaced care. She said the video alone demonstrated clear and immediate danger. She said the bruises supported a pattern of escalating harm. She said the emails suggested retaliation against a victim attempting to seek safety. She said none of these behaviors aligned with Nathan's claim that this was a joke. Then she looked at me, directly. She told me I had been incredibly brave for coming forward. She told me the court took my safety seriously. She told me what happened to me was not my fault. I had never heard those words in my entire life, not once. The judge turned to Nathan and announced her ruling. A full restraining order would be granted for 3 years. Nathan must stay at least 500 feet away from me at all times. He would be required to surrender any firearms. He would be required to complete an anger management program. She added that his behavior toward Mrs. Hawthorne during my escape warranted additional review by local law enforcement. As she spoke, Nathan's face twisted with outrage. He looked like he wanted to lunge forward, but an officer in the room stepped closer just enough to remind him of where he was. My parents collapsed in their seats, the weight of public exposure finally sinking into their expressions. Mom appeared pale, shaken. Dad stared straight ahead, stunned into silence. The hearing concluded. The judge's gavel hit the block with a sharp finality that echoed through the room like a release of air from a sealed chamber. Mrs. Hawthorne wrapped her arm around me as we stood. My attorney whispered that the worst was over. But as we walked out of that courtroom past Nathan's seething glare and my parents' devastated faces, I realized something important. This was not just about punishment. It was about truth. And after a lifetime of being silenced, my truth had finally been heard. In the days following the hearing, the consequences of everything that had been exposed began to ripple outward, touching every corner of my family's carefully constructed world. It did not happen all at once. It happened in waves, each one revealing another crack that had always been there waiting to split. The first shockwave came when Nathan's coaching job contacted him. According to the attorney, they had been informed by law enforcement of the restraining order, which was standard protocol in cases involving violence. Within 24 hours, he was placed on administrative leave. Within 72, he was formally suspended. His coaching position relied heavily on trust responsibility and reputation within the community. A restraining order for violent behavior did not align with any of those values. According to Mrs. Hawthorne, who heard the news from a teacher friend, parents were already talking. They were furious that someone who had displayed violent tendencies had been working with their children. They demanded explanations. They demanded accountability. The school district acted quickly, both to protect themselves and the families. Nathan was removed from the program indefinitely. When the official notice arrived at my parents' house, I heard later that my father tore the letter in half and punched the kitchen cabinet hard enough to split the wood. My mother cried for hours, repeating over and over that everything could have been avoided if I had just stayed quiet. But the world no longer cared about their version of quiet. Their son was no longer the golden child in the community. He was the man on the ring camera lunging after his sister. He was the man with bruises on his record. He was the man the judge had reprimanded for intimidation. The next consequence came from their church. For years, my parents had been deeply involved attending every event, volunteering for committees hosting gatherings. It was their social oxygen. But churches in small towns were also ecosystems of whispers, and the hearing had become the loudest whisper of the year. Members who had seen the video or heard pieces of the story through credible channels began distancing themselves. My parents arrived one Sunday to find that people were no longer eagerly greeting them. Conversations stopped when they walked by. Smiles became stiff, polite, or absent. A week later, the pastor requested a private meeting. During that meeting, he reportedly expressed concern about their involvement in the email sent to my workplace and their behavior during the hearing. He told them the church did not condone retaliation against victims of domestic violence. He told them he was praying for healing in their family, but he also suggested they take a temporary step back from leadership roles. Temporary step back was church language for social exile. My parents were furious. They blamed me loudly and aggressively, telling anyone who would listen that I had embarrassed them, ruined Nathan's life, destroyed their standing. But unlike before, the town did not rush to comfort them. Most people had seen enough. The next shock came when my former workplace reached out. For months, I had carried the shame of that email my parents sent, believing it had damaged my professional reputation permanently. Instead, my old supervisor called to say they had received the full explanation from my attorney and wanted to check on my safety. She said they were horrified by what my family had tried to do. She said their HR department had formally removed the email from my record. Then she asked if I was considering returning to my position. My throat tightened. For so long, I believed I had lost everything I built. Now I was being told that none of it was broken beyond repair. I told her I needed time, and she said the door would remain open whenever I was ready. Meanwhile, the restraining order began reshaping Nathan's life. Officers served him with the paperwork at home. Neighbors saw. People noticed. The presence of patrol cars in front of my parents' house became a conversation point for the entire street. The officer delivering the notice informed Nathan he had to surrender any firearms he owned. He tried to argue, but the law was clear. When he resisted, the officer gave him a warning that additional defiance would result in immediate consequences. Nathan complied, but his anger simmered visibly. He completed an intake interview for a mandated anger management program. According to the attorney, these programs evaluated not only behavior, but risk. Nathan had to sit in front of counselors who asked him why he chased me, why he slammed the car, why he left bruises on my wrist. His inability to convincingly lie to professionals became part of his file. As for my parents, they found themselves socially isolated. The phone stopped ringing, friends stopped visiting. Invitations dried up. Their narrative about me being the problem no longer held weight against the undeniable evidence shown in court. Their attempts to paint me as unstable were now seen as manipulative, even cruel. Then something happened that shocked even me. A distant relative from out of state reached out to me. She said she had heard pieces of the story and wanted to tell me something she had never shared with anyone. She said my father had always favored Nathan even as a child, to a degree that concerned other family members. She said they had noticed patterns years ago, but my parents dismissed any concerns. Hearing her say that made the ground beneath me shift. I realized the truth was bigger than I had ever imagined. This was not new. My family had been this way long before I had words for any of it. The final consequence I learned about was quiet but profound. My parents were officially flagged by the local police department for emotional involvement in a domestic violence case. It meant any future accusations of harm manipulation or interference would be treated with heightened seriousness. They could no longer hide behind their reputations. They could no longer pretend nothing happened. They could no longer control the narrative. And for the first time in my life, the truth did not bend to my brother. It did not fold under my parents' pressure. It did not crumble when they tried to rewrite it. It stood, solid, visible, permanent. That truth did not erase the trauma. It did not undo the years I lost, but it did something else. It cleared a path forward, a path that belonged to me. The first morning in my new apartment felt unreal in the quietest, gentlest way. Sunlight spilled through the blinds in soft stripes, warming the hardwood floor, glinting off the small potted plant Mrs. Hawthorne insisted I keep by the window. I stood barefoot in the middle of the living room, surrounded by boxes I had yet to unpack, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant chirping of birds outside. For the first time in my life, the silence did not scare me. It felt open. It felt mine. The apartment was small with one bedroom and a narrow balcony that overlooked a modest courtyard, but it was the most beautiful place I had ever lived because every inch of it represented something I had never been allowed before: autonomy, safety, peace. I funded the security deposit with part of the small civil settlement my attorney had negotiated with Nathan's insurance after the court ruling. It was not a fortune, but it was enough to start over without leaning on anyone who wished to control me. I used some of the money to change my last name. Signing the new documents felt like stepping out of a shadow I had lived under my entire life. The old name carried weight I no longer wanted to carry. I chose a name that meant renewal, one that held no connection to Nathan, my parents, or the history that clung to them. When the change became official, I felt lighter than I had in years. Mrs. Hawthorne helped me move in. She insisted on carrying the lighter boxes and spent hours arranging my kitchen cabinets, as if setting up a safe new life required precise organization. When she finished, she stepped back, wiped her hands on her jeans, and smiled proudly. She told me the place suited me. I told her I never would have made it here without her. She shook her head gently and said I had done the hardest part myself. After she left that evening, I walked through the apartment, slowly touching the edges of countertops, brushing my fingers over the fabric of the couch, opening and closing drawers, just to prove to myself that nothing was going to be taken from me. Each sound echoed warmly in the empty rooms. I hung a few framed prints on the wall. Nothing dramatic, just soft watercolor landscapes that made me feel calm. I placed my graduation photo on the bookshelf, not because I wanted to remember the day, but because I wanted to reclaim it. It was the only childhood milestone that had ever belonged solely to me. As I arranged the photo, I thought about calling my old workplace. I still did not know if I was ready to return. The thought of stepping back into a structured environment after everything made my chest tighten, but the idea no longer terrified me. It felt like a possibility, a door I could choose to open, not one forced on me. Later that night, after unpacking a few more boxes, I stepped out onto the balcony. The air was cool and carried the earthy scent of late afternoon rain. I leaned on the railing and looked up at the sky streaked with gold and soft lavender. For the first time in months, my breathing felt steady. I could still feel the scars of everything that happened. Trauma does not disappear simply because truth prevails. But something in me had begun to root itself again, like a plant finding soil after being uprooted too many times. I thought about Nathan, about the anger in his face when the restraining order was issued, about the hollow punch of watching the judge acknowledge my pain after a lifetime of dismissal. I thought about my parents sitting behind him with their world collapsing quietly around them, refusing to accept what they had done. I knew I might never hear an apology. I knew the fantasy of reconciliation had died long before I ever walked into that courtroom. And strangely, I did not want it anymore. Closure no longer meant repairing something broken. Closure meant walking away from something that had been hurting me for years. My phone buzzed. It was a message from Mrs. Hawthorne. She asked if I had settled in. I wrote back that I had and that the apartment finally felt like a place I could breathe. She sent a small heart emoji, something sweet and simple that made my chest tighten with gratitude. After messaging her, I opened my journal for the first time since leaving my parents' home. I wrote slowly, letting the words come without judgment. I wrote about fear, about survival, about the water in the bathtub, about the ring camera, about the courtroom, about the moment the judge looked at me and called me brave. And then I wrote about now. About standing in my own apartment, about sunlight, about safety, about possibility. When I finished, I placed the journal on the bedside table and looked at myself in the mirror across the room. My reflection looked tired but alive, bruised but healing, uncertain but free. I whispered the words I wished someone had said to me when I was young. I whispered that I was enough. I whispered that I was safe now, and for the first time I believed it. As I turned off the lights and climbed into bed, the quiet enveloped me not as a threat, but as a promise. A promise that tomorrow would not be shaped by fear. A promise that my life would no longer be measured by the weight of other people's expectations or cruelty. A promise that I had reclaimed my story. And as I lay in the soft glow of the bedside lamp, I whispered one last truth into the darkness, a truth that belonged entirely to me. They left me to drown, but I rose anyway, and I would never ask their permission to live again. There is something about a story like Emily's that lingers long after the video fades to black. Maybe it is because so many of us, no matter how old we get, still carry the echoes of houses where love had conditions, where silence was expected, and where survival meant learning to shrink ourselves. Maybe it is because some of you watching right now have lived through your own version of this. Maybe the faces and names were different, but the feeling was the same. That deep ache of realizing the very people who were supposed to protect you were the ones who taught you fear. If you have ever walked out of a house you once called home with your hands shaking, if you have ever packed a bag in the early hours of the morning and whispered to yourself, "I need to get out," then you know exactly why Emily's story matters. It is not just about what she escaped. It is about what she reclaimed. And tonight, I want to ask you something directly. Have you ever been the one who stayed quiet just to keep the peace? Did you ever swallow your own pain because speaking up felt dangerous or pointless? Did you give people chance after chance until the last piece of yourself was almost gone? If that was you, or if that is you right now, I hope Emily's voice gave you a little bit of your own back. Because the truth is, healing rarely comes wrapped in something dramatic. Sometimes it begins with the first person who believes you. Sometimes it begins with the courage to tell the truth out loud. And sometimes it begins with a simple, terrifying step out of a door at sunrise. When we share stories like this, it is not to dwell in darkness. It is to break the silence around the kind of hurt that thrives when nobody talks about it. It is to remind someone who might be watching from a quiet room with the curtains drawn that what they are enduring is not normal, not deserved, not a burden they have to carry alone. And let me say this with absolute clarity. If you saw yourself in Emily, you are not dramatic. You are not overreacting. You are not weak. You are someone who deserved better and still deserves better tomorrow. Stories like this often stir something deep, especially for those of us who have lived long enough to know how heavy life can become. That is why I want to hear from you. What part of Emily's story hit you the hardest? Was it the moment her parents chose silence over protection? Was it the Ring camera catching the truth her family tried to bury? Was it the judge's words finally validating what she spent her entire life doubting? Or was it that final moment standing in her own apartment for the first time, breathing freely after years of suffocating? If you feel comfortable, share your thoughts, your experiences, or even your support for others in the comments. You never know who might read what you write and feel a little less alone because of it. And if your story is too personal or too painful to write out, that is okay. Just leave a single word that says you're here, that you understand that you survived. Safe, standing, healing, free. Sometimes one word is enough to let someone else know they're not invisible. And before you scroll away, take a moment to check in with yourself. Are you carrying something heavy tonight? Are you healing from someone who was supposed to love you? Are you finally building a life that belongs to you? If so, I hope this space gives you a breath, a pause, a reminder that you are not alone in the hard parts or the hopeful ones. Thank you for watching, for listening, and for being part of a community that believes in standing with people who have been pushed down for far too long. And if you want more stories like this told with honesty heart and the understanding that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is simply start over, then stay with us. The road out of the darkness is easier to walk when someone is walking beside you.